Anyway.
Do you need to snap again?
The interface revival.
You're a good snapper. Yes, the interface revival, the beginning of that, the fact that we had synthesizers that originally were knob laden.
Yes.
That were these wonderful.
It was the only way to do it.
Right. That was how you did it. You know, there was no such thing as an LCD screen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was about you grab this knob, you change this, or in the case of the modular stuff, you take an LFO and run CV over to this and have it change it for you. But the fact is, it was very hands-on or manual in some way. And then, you know, the 80s came around and we realized that we could go ahead and create incredible sounding instruments, but we didn't need to spend all of that money on all those knobs and sliders.
Or drilling holes in a panel even.
Yep, exactly. We could go ahead and just have like a number pad. We could have maybe like one or two sliders, and one of those is dedicated to master volume. and then we have a screen.
Yeah.
And there might be some buttons around the screen that allow you to pick something, but then you're hitting that data slider and you're changing everything. And for those of us that in our heads we're thinking, that synth sounds awesome, the interface wasn't as big a deal because, oh my gosh, I can do things that I never could do before. Like the M1 was one of those instruments that I got at one point because I was like, oh my gosh, it's
everything you could ever want.
It's 8 instrument multi-timbral.
Yeah.
So it can simultaneously do 8 instruments. And it had built-in drums. It had a built-in piano. Pianos were hard to do. I mean, for years we were trying to get synthesizers to sound kind of more like pianos. This one, it had a sampled piano in there. Now, granted, it's the M1 piano. We know that
We've all heard of it.
It's not a piano. It's the M1 piano. Stuff
and
like
we talk
that.
about all these features, these complexities. That's part of why we lost all the knobs per function, right? Because there's more options, and it's hard to design a good interface, and it's hard to, especially at that time.
Yeah.
Do we have a ton of knobs? You know what I mean?
It would literally be prohibitively. It would have doubled, if not tripled, the price of that instrument.
The D50 programmer, the PG-1000,
right?
They're cramped. They're hardly labeled, those knobs.
A lot of, and this may be blasphemy too, but I think we're on the same page
Go
on
ahead.
this. The PG-1000 programmer for the D50 is a pain in the you-know-what.
I haven't tried one.
When we talk about the iWord interface, this is not an interface. It is literally just 3 rows.
I think so.
3 or 4 rows of sliders.
Yep.
I owned one for almost 20 years. I used it 5 times. I would much rather use software. There's a wonderful iPad app, Patchbase.
Sure.
Made I can't
Coffee
remember.
shop?
What?
Coffee shop?
Coffee shop. Yep. Extraordinary piece of software, and it's got D50 editor. It's got the JV2080.
Yeah.
It's got the CZ101.
It's got the interface.
It's got the interface for you there. And it allows you to do what you need to do, and it's a librarian too. So
Wonderful.
any of your patches you create in
I
there,
might
you
have come
can
across
save.
that looking for editors for my 6-track, my sequential 6-track.
But the fact is that PG-1000, you had the JX3P and the PG-200.
Correct.
I had the MKS-30 and the PG-200. And the PG-200 was a wonderful editor for that synthesizer.
It feels good to use it.
It feels great.
It's laid out in a logical way.
It's laid out logically. It makes sense. Exactly what the PG-1000 is not.
In part, again, because there's so many more
It's so
parameters they need to
complex.
squeeze into there.
No, I don't mean to beat Roland up over
but
that.
it makes it harder to interact with it.
It does.
Whatever the cause of that, it ends up being harder to interact with. And that's important for you and myself. That's what we want to do with these instruments, is interact with them.
Interact with them. We were exploring with new types of synthesis. We had additive synthesis.
I think about the Ensoniq stuff.
Oh yeah, whether it be like the wavetable, the transwave, and the stuff that they started playing with there, the sampling stuff that they did, like with the EPS, the Mirage.
Yep.
They started exploring with stuff at a budget conscious way that allowed us to get our affordable Fairlight and start doing things that were way out of our price range before. But whether it be that or whether it be let's see, I said wavetable, the wave station, vector synthesis, the Prophet VS, We had a bunch of interesting engines that all came out there in late 80s into the 90s and through the 90s, and then Romplers, kind of
Took
came
over.
into be. And I think we agreed that there's a stigma there that we don't necessarily think should be such a bad
If something
thing.
sounds good, it is good. And people have these preconceptions about, synths weren't cool in the late 90s or whatever, or Romplers don't sound good. But even the sound cabinet stuff, which wasn't like fancy or expensive to me, sounds wonderful.
Sounds great.
Because the samples are cool.
Right.
And interesting, and the way you interact with it is fine enough to manipulate those samples and make them
Absolutely.
interesting. But
And that's the manipulation part that's important, because a lot of people, when they hear the word Rompler, they think, oh,
It's a preset machine.
It's not a sampler because you can't make your own samples. You're stuck with the ones they give you, and all it does is play those back. And no, those waveforms in most real synthesizers that are Rompler based are simply your beginning.
Yep.
That is your oscillator.
and even if you're just able to filter it, that to me is manipulating it.
Yeah, a good filter on that, great. But you add to that, the ability to have your envelopes, have the envelope apply to the filter, go ahead and put an LFO on something in there, and suddenly you've got a synthesizer, but instead of starting with just a sawtooth, a sine, like a triangle wave or something, you're starting with a much more complex waveform, and then you're shaping that. And the people that tend to look down on them say, yes, but it's not a live waveform. It's a static waveform. And every time you trigger that, it's going to be the exact same waveform. Well, you know what? If you're running it through a filter that has an LFO on it that is actually creating
There's your
modulation
movement.
there, you have some variation. You have ways to make variation with that doesn't make it sound like you're just hitting the same exact thing over and over.
With a good interface or a well-designed instrument, you can program around these limitations or these perceptions that this isn't going to sound warm or organic or whatever.
Right.
With more gear or good programming, you can really work your way around that.
Absolutely. And honestly, it's not even working your way around it. It's just recognizing that origin
Is my
that you're
that's just my
starting with,
beginning. Yeah.
and that it may be a static waveform, but that static waveform is way more complex than any of the simple waveforms you could have started out with. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying Romplers are better than regular analog samplers.
They're different.
No, they're synthesizers.
And they do a different
they're
job.
Different. So we then went through that phase. We had the Romplers.
Yes.
We had all of these different types of synthesis, but we had lost the interface.
Yeah.
We had great potential. And honestly, one of the reasons that we didn't have the interface is what you said already, is the fact that if you tried to put knob per function on there, you would be just overwhelmed by the amount of controls that it would also be intimidating, and it wouldn't be a good interface. So the question is, where's that balance in between? And what happened? What happened was what we call the interface revival. And we realized, you know what? An instrument that sounds great in and of itself is awesome, but being able to connect with it,
And
as we've been
interact
saying
with
the
it.
whole time, that interaction, that interface is almost as important, and in some cases more important than just what it sounds like.
Yeah. And that's important for you and myself. That's what we want to do with these instruments.
We
is
want
interact
to
with them.
Interact with them. We want to bond with them, and we want them to be an extension of what we are visualizing or what we're hearing in our
Right.
heads.
Right.
And to be able to get that muscle memory to say, oh yeah, over here, that's
There's
where
my
that is. Or
cutoff.
whatever.
There's my envelope amount.
You're playing the chord, and you don't even think about it. Your just hand goes
Reach for
right
it.
there. And when we were talking about that before, I was talking about how I will choose an instrument up front based on that destination where I want to go.
Yeah.
And I have overlap between many of my instruments, as I'm sure you do too. Like you did the discussion where you had like the analogs, the Base Station 2, the Mofo.
Tried a bunch of different monos.
And each of those monos can do some very similar things.
Right. But they accomplish it in a different way. And the way you interact with them is very different.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's that interface that will guide you more easily to get to one destination with one, whereas with another one, you may end up having to do menu diving to get there or
Exactly.
something.
Yeah.
And when you know where you want to go and you have a choice of instruments, all of which can get there, you're going to pick the one that takes you there the most easily. The most
Whether you
naturally.
know it the best or it's laid out in a way that you can figure it out.
Right. And what happens is it doesn't even become a conscious decision. At some point, you just say, I need this sound, and I'm
This is
just
the synth for the
automatically
job.
go to that, and I know that I'm going to get there. I may already have a patch for it, or I know how to program that in really quickly, and then we're going to be on our way. But
That's how I determine a setup, is I need a job for this, a job for this, a job for this.
yeah,
You know what I mean? This is my polysynth now. This is my piano sound now, electric piano, whatever. That's how I, decide what I'm going to sit down with. And it's normally what am I most comfortable with in this category? Or what do I have right now that does this job well enough for me to want to use it? The overlap conversation becomes, this interface can do, or this instrument can do a lot, but it's quicker for me to get a bass sound on another keyboard, on another piece of gear. And that's where the differences are made in these things, is the way you interact with them.
right.
Yeah.
And that was that distinguishing feature that started to happen when we suddenly had all of these instruments that came out that had simplified the user interface,
Yes.
but basically just kind of threw out a bunch of stuff and hid it in menus. But they still sounded wonderful.
Yep.
Now, granted, if it sounds horrible, it doesn't matter how good the interface is. But there are not. I can't think of a lot of instruments that I would say suck.
Right.
There are
Especially
some,
ones with a bad interface, or with a good interface, excuse me.
right, exactly.
Because you can work around whatever issue, whatever suck, you know what I mean?
Yes,
You see.
you turn down the suck knob, and then everything's much better. So,
Precisely.
but that concept of realizing that we had lost our way,
Yes.
that
And we've more than come back around.
we have.
Think about
And
how great the interfaces are on things we've worked with today, or touched today.
absolutely the Hydrasynth.
Is a great example for a lot of this stuff.
But yeah, like the JD800 and some of those older ones, the Andromeda,
Yeah, Elise's.
the Alesis Andromeda 6. Just the name threw out of my head, and I pictured it with the little cosmic bubbles going off in different
That's the way.
directions.
That's the way it's laid out.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
That was one of those things that said analog is important, and you need a bunch of knobs, and that realization that we all kind of pivoted back into, oh, you know what, we should do this.
This is
Now,
what was fun about this. This is what is amazing about this.
Yeah, it made it fun, but it made it, because honestly, how many people that own DX7s programmed the DX7?
Less than 10%, right?
Yeah, there's a reason why they say that over 85, I think it's over 85% of all DX7s that were ever like sold back or traded in or whatever had the original presets.
Factory was on there.
Yep, factory set.
But how true is that for a Juno? And how true is that for, anything with a complete user interface that's fun and easy to interact with? By the time it makes it to somebody else's hand, are all those presets factory? I think it's pretty unlikely.